Hello and welcome to Edinburgh Skeptics in Lockdown. Tonight we've got L Briant from Bard College, New York, talking to us about Cambridge Analytica, and it's the talk I've been most excited about since managing to bag her. And yes, so before we get on to Emma's talk tonight, I want to encourage you to share a donation if you can spare some money. If you'd normally come to one of our fringe shows or any free fringe show, through the PBH Fringe, and you would have normally given them a few quid and you haven't been able to get to a show this year, then please give them a donation on PayPal. It's paypal.me/freefringe, and that will appear in the break as well. Also, before we get on to the talk tonight, I want to tell you about our next talk, which will be on the 15th of September. It is called Muddy Waters, and it's on going off the film Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo. When I went to see that, which was the last film we saw before lockdown, first thing I did when I got home was call my dad, because he's a chemical regulator, and kind of asked him, would this ever happen? So when one of our regulars got in touch to say, I just saw this film Dark Waters, would this ever happen? I thought, oh, we could just get my dad to come and do a talk for everyone. So that's what's happening, a bit of nepotism. So that will be on the 15th of September, and he'll tell us why the EU is the safest place to live, and Emma will tell us why we can't ever be in the EU again. And if you've got any questions about tonight's talk and you want to put those to Emma while they're on your mind, put them in the chat or get those on Twitter or on Facebook or any other form of communication, and they'll get through to me and I'll be able to ask Emma after the talk. But for now, I'll hand you over to Dr. L Briant. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it's actually an honor to be at the Fringe, even if I'm not there in person. I used to go every year when I lived in Glasgow in Scotland, and I miss the Fringe very much indeed. It really is wonderful to be here with you all. And thanks everyone for tuning in remotely. So I'm sure, given the audience, no one will have missed in 2018 the craziness that ensued when Cambridge Analytica and its unethical parent company, SCL, catapulted to international notoriety with really far-reaching consequences around the world. Reported by Harold Cadwallader from The Guardian, and the big Channel 4 sting that caught them in the act, as well as obviously the important testimony from the whistleblowers, such as Chris Wiley, and even myself and my own contribution, which helped to reveal the massive scandal of concerning activities that exposed not just Cambridge Analytica and SCL, but really an entire influence industry that's barely regulated and has really concerning lack of oversight. Now, Chris Wiley's revelations about the purchase of millions of Facebook users' data around the world also triggered a second related scandal about Facebook's complicity in monetizing personal data, of course, which resulted in hefty fines for the platform and attempts to force them to take responsibility for online disinformation and algorithms that advanced the far right. This is obviously a battle that we're still fighting today, and looking for answers on how we solve this really important crisis. The Cambridge Analytica case, of course, led to Facebook being fined €1 billion in the EU. And in the US, the Federal Trade Commission fined Facebook $5 billion. And took action against CEO Alexander Nix and the scientist Alexander Kogan. As well as CA being found in violation of UK law by the ICO when they refused to give an American citizen data that related to him. But there were also worldwide many more investigations, and there's still a hell of a lot to be revealed about this company. At the moment, I am writing a book about Cambridge Analytica because a lot of the attention has been on Facebook, quite rightly, and the other platforms. But I personally believe that the industry of influencers that create the content that is shared on Facebook is also lacking attention, and we know very little really about what they're doing. And we need to really be subjecting these people to more scrutiny. So to focus a little bit on another related dimension of this, the key to the purchase of the Facebook data that was abused by Cambridge Analytica were academics from Cambridge University, including Alexander Kogan and Joseph Chancellor, who later then worked at Facebook. Kogan and Chancellor set up a company called Global Science Research and developed the app This Is Your Digital Life, which was used to gather the data, which was then bought by Cambridge Analytica and could be matched to the sort of personality indicators that could help build an extremely revealing profile of each individual in the database. This is something that, claims were made that it could perhaps help, could illuminate your personality better than your closest partner could understand you. So the personality test they mapped that people's likes onto was called Ocean, and it analyzed whether people are open, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, or neurotic. And SCL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, thought that this could help with targeting ads in American campaigns. So Cambridge Analytica were wanting to use custom audiences along with Facebook's micro-targeting tools in the American market. Social media data was much more easily available in the United States, and this was an area where they thought that they could get real competitive advantage over other companies. But Cambridge Analytica and SCL were gathering data from many sources over the years. And the ICO revealed that they had amassed 700 terabytes of data when they went bankrupt. So there was an awful lot to go through in those investigations. This deal that was exposed by Chris Wiley actually made vulnerable the personal details of around 80 million people worldwide to be used in Cambridge Analytica's political and commercial campaigns. And the company was also seeking to use the psychographic targeting that they developed for military purposes too, particularly after it was seen as successful for Trump and for Brexit in 2016. These were selling points. So the notoriety made them popular with clients, particularly global clients who maybe didn't have the best ethics. And Nix was keen to boast and bullshit, as he'd always done, about the effectiveness of the tools that they had to drive up business. The culpability, though, of Nix and some of the other key staff might be pretty clear at this point, though some escaped attention and some of the key executives gained more exposure in the press than others. But what it reveals is a complex array of differently responsible parties in this scandal, some of which actually have escaped attention entirely, and where we really haven't focused much scrutiny. So it also reveals some systemic failures in our world. And in the past, I've pointed out the involvement of governments and the role that they've played and the responsibility they have in addressing particularly government contracting. Because SCL was a government contractor that was developing its tools in part financed by government grants. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the academic involvement of SCL and Cambridge Analytica and the academics' roles in the influence industry and relationship to governments more generally in relation to propaganda. This is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and obviously, as an academic who researches in this area, I've obviously encountered a lot of the personnel who seek to obtain academic expertise, and thought an awful lot about academics' role in relation to governments and government work, and these influence campaigns and companies, and what kind of relationship we should have if we want to influence things, or if we want to try to maintain independence. These are really important issues that all academics need to think about. So I'm a British academic who's currently in New York City on a fellowship based at Bard College. And in 2018, I was actually really central to revealing the wrongdoing of Cambridge Analytica and SCL. And my knowledge about this was based on having interviewed people across the company, both for my PhD and for my last book. And I was requested to submit evidence to the parliamentary inquiry into fake news, and various other inquiries and investigations. My evidence submitted included accounts of key executives such as Nigel Oakes, the CEO of SCL, who was talking about how the company wasn't ethical, and was discussing the creation of artificial enemies for Trump. Many powerful actors can actually feel threatened by revelations like these, and not only the companies concerned, but also their clients and other actors. My role in actually helping to expose Cambridge Analytica and SCL threw my own life into mayhem, and it led to me being targeted in various different ways, including by sort of intelligence gathering efforts. I received death threats related to Brexit, and it was a very traumatic and horrible experience. And it's important to note that, because I think when academics reveal important information like this through parliamentary inquiries, there isn't always that much support available to them, especially compared to journalists, because journalists' organizations are designed to reveal things all the time. And so I would say that, as an academic, you are doing your own research, and it's quite an individual type of activity. And there are very few people you really, are able to talk to about your research, because a lot of it is, only your own expertise. And also it might be involving private information as well that you hold. So, going through something that where you're made a target can also be very difficult, because talking to others might make you more of a target. So it's a very isolating experience. And we need to support better academics who are revealing difficult information institutionally. It may well also put academics off, and I think this kind of the sort of, well, I'm going to be blunt and say bravery that's required to do something like this isn't for everyone, and quite rightly I would understand that. But unfortunately, I think that it's that we need to be doing work that is challenging power, and I think a lot of the kind of work that's done is weighted towards aiding power more readily, and a lot of financing is available for that kind of research. So you might ask how I came to be researching these companies and investigating these kinds of issues and practices, and how did I end up in the position to have unique information about an industry that usually hides in the shadows. At the time, propaganda was actually a fairly unusual subject to study. I remember during my first presentation that I did being told as a PhD student that I was unlikely to gain access to interview people involved in the military propaganda because I was a woman and a young student, and these people would never talk to me. So, there were barriers from the start of people telling me, actually, this can't be done. There were also people who would say that that propaganda doesn't work anymore in an internet age, and it's pointless looking at this because people can't be influenced. The internet makes information freely available that anyone can access, and there was a lot of ignorance, I think, about how the architecture of our information environment is set up. um, and people not really realizing how the strategies are deployed. um, Particularly those coming from a journalistic background who see often journalists' role in being able to see through all of these strategies. And unfortunately, journalism doesn't always function that way. um, so, uh, so, um, uh, so many scholars also sort of poo-pooed this idea that propaganda even works in an internet age, and that people are, media has strong effects on people. Seeing the notion that people could be influenced as old-fashioned and somehow deterministic. Strategic communication, though, and public diplomacy were the sort of acceptable orientations of research. So people trying to develop strategies to influence more effectively. My work on psyops and critical assessments of propaganda were often met with rolling eyes, even after the initial news broke about Cambridge Analytica. But now it's great to see that everybody is seeking to put forward solutions for the digital crises, and has started to more readily focus on disinformation. We really need this kind of propaganda studies renewal. But I would say that how we're going about this needs some reorientation. So I'll start by going back to the beginning. I want to start talking to you about how all this emerged, where it all began. So I'll start first by telling you a little bit about the background and the origins of SCL, the company that gave birth to Cambridge Analytica, if you like. They used methods that were developed through an interesting array of defense operations that they were involved in. And they were developing methods before Cambridge Analytica began its experiments with big data in, maybe we might say, more traditional types of data gathering. So that includes kind of surveys and interviews, but they also were experimenting with other types of data gathering that might be, we might call more attuned to human intelligence gathering methods. And so the types of research that they were doing were trying to develop ways to better change behavior. And the modeling of all of this around behavioral change was quite something that quite interested me during my PhD. Nigel Oakes was an ad man who, in 1989, he left his job in the ad industry and was getting frustrated with the sort of orthodoxy of that industry. He felt that they just didn't get persuasion, and he believed it was deeply rooted in unconscious motivators and emotions, and that the type of work that should be done on campaigns was rooted more in behavioral science. So what he did was he went along to the University of London and he sought to speak to psychologists there about how it might be possible to improve the science of persuasion. He met with professors there, Adrian Furnham and Barry Gunter also, and he worked on some early ideas developing methods in that area, setting up what was known as the Behavioral Dynamics Institute. That makes it sound really professional, but I would say it's not really an institute. It never really was a proper institute. It was more of a research collective that was used to generate ideas and methodologies. and fed into several commercial companies that he set up over the years. They, for instance, in the first early days, were exploring how smells might cause people to buy more bread in a supermarket, for instance. And Oak set up a number of entities seeking to harness the sort of claims of sound scientific prowess in order to make money in influence in global campaigns. So he had Furnham and Gunther's involvement in the first days, but this was kind of short-lived. And he was reaching out to other academics who he felt might be able to contribute more to the type of work he wanted to do. He worked on a number of early campaigns, including in post-apartheid South Africa and Indonesia, but the success was really quite patchy in sort of getting campaigns until the setting up of SCL in 2004. And its primary purpose was as a defense contractor. But without Alexander Nix developing the sort of political markets and commercial markets around the world with the help of the defense team's people, and of course still drawing on these BDI methods. Meanwhile, the start of the War on Terror was an important moment for governments, opening up academia to military cooperation. Academics were being recruited extensively to assist in the War on Terror, many believing it was a patriotic duty, others believing that cultural understanding was essential for ending conflicts and resolving hostilities. At the same time, billions were being spent on private sector expertise, as propaganda entities had not been a priority after the end of the Cold War. Indeed, entities such as the US Information Agency had been absorbed into the State Department, and the US government was desperate to understand how to fight counterinsurgency wars that were taking place around the world and spreading. A whole industry of apparent terrorism experts emerged, and a lot of companies seeking to exploit this. So governments were desperate to obtain an advantage and were plowing billions into these solutions. Anybody who was coming to sell them some solutions on how to better change the minds of terrorists. So we had also huge amounts of money going into building digital information infrastructure, which was emerging. A nascent internet had been developed by military research funding and was launched, of course, as private enterprises. And the internet was free to be used and abused by anyone, with these Silicon Valley technologies being developed in universities, often by idealists, as a result of government-funded research. These were becoming the surveillance, commercially lucrative public infrastructure that we are now all talking through, that Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism. The War on Terror era legislation, such as the Patriot Act, for instance, enabled a global influence industry to weaponize our digital world for the advancement of profit, power, and political influence ultimately. Powerful actors harnessed the growth of social media, turning the dream of this free internet into a manipulative mass surveillance nightmare. Academics have worked to make apps like Facebook and games used for data gathering online more addictive, based on tricks in the technology to gather more data more secretly, thus making it all more and more commercially profitable. We're starting to look at this now. But, you know, the damage has already been done. A lot of the data is already out there. As whistleblowers like Snowden revealed, governments built backdoors into the system and saw great potential for tracking threat networks and gathering data online. Likewise, in Israel, for its counterterrorism campaigns, conscription drove personnel through well-funded agencies that would come out the other side, and then who set up private intelligence companies, spyware, and influence companies for hire. This lucrative world has emerged full of surveillance architecture and influence firms that have blossomed globally. At this time, I was doing my PhD in Glasgow and looking at counterterrorism propaganda and how it was being adapted to the new conflict and media environment. And I was interviewing people across the UK and US governments working in influence and propaganda, including contractors and think tanks who were seeking to court academics. Everyone from psychologists to anthropologists, and trying to get them to understand foreign audiences more effectively, and maybe even develop ways of persuading them to change their behaviors. I even got approached by a contractor who was seeking to have me help do media analysis for the UAE. I didn't do this, just for the record. But what I'm saying is, like, there were all these opportunities where academics are invited to try and help. So academics later then become implicated in all sorts of different activities. Many of them are doing work that, arguably might be considered to be very ethical, to try to help governments to understand audiences in parts of the world where development work is going on, for instance, and where they're trying to end conflicts. However, some academics were also implicated in government's activities in the Iraq War in relation to torture, even. Others aided propaganda, and I interviewed one director at the Potomac Institute in my last book, a think tank in Washington, D.C., who helped to recruit academics for assisting military influence campaigns. And he laughed about waterboarding and criticized some social scientists who didn't want to get involved in what he called baby killing, the violence of war and conflict. And he saw this as very naive. At the same time, governments, of course, were arrogant and ignorant, and they had got themselves into a war under false pretenses that was resulting in millions of lives lost. And they had no idea how to understand local populations. Mistakes and misunderstandings lost lives. And some in the military thought Iraq would be like Afghanistan. They honestly expected that these cultures were almost transferable, and that they didn't understand that Iraq had an advanced media system in comparison to Afghanistan. So politicians and the military made a lot of mistakes, and many academics, understandably, felt that they might be able to change things for the better. And felt that communication and understanding would help reduce killing, and wanted to end wars. The US and UK governments called on academics in the private sector to help them understand media and propaganda. And they quickly learned that marketing people that they had hired early on to run counterterrorism campaigns didn't know the first thing about local cultures in Iraq or cutting terrorist recruitment. SCL were a small player at that time, and they launched a big effort to get these kinds of contracts in 2006 at a London defense show. And they were seeking to present themselves differently to the advertising, PR, and marketing firms that were selling government snake oil. Nigel Oakes' assertion they were a defense information operations specialist was also underpinned by science hinged on his Behavioral Dynamics Institute, or BDI, a research hub for SCL's campaigns. Oakes was trying to court the newly emergent discipline of public diplomacy scholars. And he believed that it was important to understand under what conditions behavior will change, and then create those conditions for that change to occur. But he was no social scientist. A professor at University of Leeds, the late Phil Taylor, who was a respected expert on propaganda, authoring many books over the years, became close to both US and the UK military at this time through his research. He was the perfect person for Nigel to make a director of his institute, both to help develop propaganda tools and to facilitate his own military networks as he sought contracts. Taylor was quite ideological about the value of persuasion in warfare, and he was quite close to the military. He not only developed BDI's methods, but he also did training for SCL, including in Singapore. Nigel Oakes in 2006 hosted and funded a launch event with Taylor at the Forefront, a conference drawing in significant academics, where they were wined and dined at Cliveden Country House in Berkshire, an odd choice of location considering it was a historical meeting place of the Cliveden set, known for Hitler's appeasement during the war. For Nigel Oakes, sponsoring an academic conference was a way to harness both the expertise and the reputations of social scientists to parade SCL's credibility before an influential figure in the US military, Jeffrey B. Jones, who then helped SCL to get crucial contracts. The event also formed the basis for the first Routledge Handbook on Public Diplomacy. Public diplomacy is one of the foreign policy tools that governments use and an instrument in the information domain. It includes government-linked broadcasting like Voice of America and should be understood as a tool of white, generally truthful propaganda to communicate foreign policy and culture abroad. As it's a more honest means of exerting influence that seeks to communicate culture and engage publics, academics have often seen it as more democratic and useful for peace building. It's the domain, for instance, of the State Department and the FCO in the UK, and an academic field has grown up around making it more effective. It influences much research on disinformation and propaganda today, and usually focuses on what foreign actors do to the West and how it can become countered by the West. As a practice, public diplomacy is also used by governments in coordination with and alongside other methods of propaganda. And often studies tend to fail to engage with the whole array of tools, which are used together, of course, by Western governments, or see them in context, which is essential for understanding government's communicative power in our world. Propaganda is a cross-governmental activity, often thought of as a spectrum from black, untruthful and secretive operations to white, truthful and transparent communications. This is a little simplistic, but it helps to get our minds around the basics. Methods include military deception aimed at the enemy, and psyops in a military context, which psychological operations may be white or grey, and also public affairs or military media operations, which engage with the media and are meant to be white. There are fewer studies of the kinds of propaganda, such as psychological operations or deception in warfare, that are harder to access in terms of data for researchers. So this leads to something of an imbalance in the field of study of propaganda studies and creates a weaker understanding of what democracies do in relation to others. I would argue that you can't understand a propaganda war by looking at only one side. What is done is often misunderstood, and critics of democracy's propaganda need also to retain awareness that other countries, such as Russia, are indeed sometimes also threatening and engaging in efforts to manipulate as well. So essentially, a lot of the time when we are looking at propaganda, we either are focusing on the UK and what the UK does and critiquing what the UK does, or we're focusing on Russia and we become an expert on Russia and we forget to look at what the UK is doing or looking at what America's doing, for instance. And this kind of myopic focus is really, really unhelpful for developing some kind of scientific appreciation of the actual whole information war. So back to SCL. Nigel Oakes, in reaching out to these public diplomacy scholars, was seeking to find social scientists who would be interested in working on the research behind SCL's work and enhancing the art of persuasion. I'm certain that the majority of academics who attended the Cliveden conference had little knowledge about the most unethical of the campaigns that SCL was engaged in. Few seem to have also been interested in helping Oakes in the campaigns. But the platform did also raise his credibility, and I think that's an important factor we should acknowledge. Over the years, Nigel Oakes's efforts impressed some academics as well across a range of different fields who wanted to get involved in trying to counter terrorists. Maybe they were geeky about the methods that they were developing, and they wanted to, work with people who were like-minded and gather data. He was successful in building a substantial network of interested scholars to work with the BDI. And the website that they had listed just 22 members over the years, but I know there were many, many more academic collaborators and researchers assisting with SCL's methods development and projects. I was actually suggested myself to get involved with them a couple of times, but did not. Academics were mostly unpaid, but gained real-world access to campaigns, for instance, or experience, and even hard to get data on occasion. The apparent separation between BDI, the research network, and SCL, the company, helped academics that were worried by involvement in campaigns feel that they were keeping their hands clean, of course. Yet it's unclear how many really thought hard about how their insights and credibility might be being used not just for SCL to advance its work on military campaigns that they might have thought was an ethical use of their time, but also its involvement in politics around the world, often in places not known for their human rights. One could ask if academics should care more about how their research might be being used beyond the immediate work that they are doing. Some considered perhaps that this was just the way the world is, and apparent distance helped to keep their public image clean. Few who did work for SCL have declared it publicly. Not all were involved in wrongdoing, it must be emphasized. So, the relationships between these companies and these academics, it's complicated. But how transparent should universities be when their staff are working on external campaigns for influence companies? Well, Cambridge University attempted repeatedly to obfuscate attempts by Paul Olivier de Haye, a data rights campaigner, to gain information through freedom of information requests. A key argument that's been relied on by universities is the assertion that the information sought relates to personal activities, not university activities, so it's exempt from freedom of information. Well, a lot of this work might have been gained through their reputation as an academic. And of course, the experience on the campaign then builds experience that they may well be teaching from, because you can't separate these things in your mind. And it might be said that students should be aware, perhaps, of if their lecturers might have been involved in with a company that was doing unethical work. SCL Elections, I discovered, also sought academics to help with their work from Oxford University. They weren't involved with the Cambridge Analytica data gathering with psychographics. But I wrote recently about a professor there who was aiding SCL in research for a political campaign in Argentina in 2015. And involved in data analytics. For Cambridge Analytica's work in Argentina, it's been reported to that there was outreach to an intelligence company offering tools that would be really concerning in an election campaign. And my argument in the freedom of information requests I made was that data held by Oxford University was deeply important to this kind of investigation and to helping us to understand what really happened. Academics may well not have known all of the details of what was being done in the campaigns that they were involved in, but enough was made public to raise concern. And one has to question how many questions they asked when getting involved in these campaigns in an industry that is quite opaque. Another academic who SCL had tried to recruit in 2010, who had shown interest in their more unethical campaigns, was also invited to a conference that was being run by that academic at Oxford University in December, speaking about why I was not worried about Cambridge Analytica and you shouldn't have been either. Neither of them declaring publicly any connection to their company, to the companies. Now, one could say that this was a bit of a conflict of interest, putting on a talk like this without declaring one's alignment and past experience and relationships with these companies. I tried to submit freedom of information requests and been repeatedly rebuffed, even making a complaint to the ICO, British Information Commissioner's Office. Universities have even hired Cambridge Analytica or considered hiring them for their own marketing to try and recruit students, including my former employer, University of Sheffield. But an important question is like whether academics and universities or any other clients for that matter are able to find out enough about these companies and their activities in order to make a valid assessment about whether this is an ethical company or not. The point is that we don't know enough about the influence industry. It's under-researched and it exists in the darkness, completely unregulated in many countries around the world. My own research has taken a critical sociological sort of position that research should interrogate the legitimacy of structures of power. And in this area of propaganda studies, there's an inescapable power imbalance and knowledge gap. Not to do so would be to assume the position of power. Yet, as one scholar of ethics, William May, has observed, the social order does not tidily divide the powerful and the powerless, the subordinate and the superordinate. Life is never so simple. Academics have power, but they may also be in a powerless position of not having enough information themselves. Academics rightly want to help governments to do things better, to have an influence, to help their knowledge change the world in a positive way. Some get too close as a result of that. And if so, one sits in a position in opposition to governments, one often is excluded and can be too distant to really understand it. Indeed, one can be used by those who seek to attack one's own government. And might not have enough access to data to actually be able to investigate and find the truth. We can't create policy to change things that are opaque and hidden, though. And we need to research in this area that supports principles of, in a way that supports principles of independence, and without adopting a side and excluding important data about one side or the other. Governments need to be more transparent with us, and we need to be able to issue freedom of information requests, for instance, to government contractors, which isn't available to us at the moment. Platforms need to be putting out data relating to both sides in the influence wars, not just to countries that are considered the enemy, so that we understand what's going on better. And we cannot see the sort of abusers, the abuses that academic communication studies are repurposed for in aiding their advances. Psychologists, data scientists, communication scholars have sometimes naively and complicitly or complicitly assisted influence firms and governments' development of tools that are being built and used in anti-democratic ways. So today I'm asking, why are more academics not looking at this powerful influence industry and who's funding them? Really, to be useful, studies should also not be solely looking at content and dissemination of propaganda. There's much to be done in looking at online content misinformation and how it spreads online. But also, we need to be watching the watchers, these companies like Cambridge Analytica and SCL and the rest of the influence industry. It's huge. This was one small company. There is a multi-billion-dollar industry out there that is escaping most academics' attention at the moment. And we need to be watching these companies and influencers, whether they're from democratic countries or authoritarian regimes, and understanding that these dynamics are related and that industries are global and threats to democracy come from all sides. We need to stop thinking that this is too hard to access because it's hidden, and stop aligning ourselves with one side or another, and start funding more research on elites internationally, pushing for data about how they use power, making this more transparent for research, and not just the data of public consumers of the messaging, with an aim to try to counter what's put out by one side or another. This way, scholarship will not be playing catch up in understanding power. Now, that's my talk. I don't know if I was 45 minutes, but I was trying to time it to such. And I'm really looking forward to answering any questions that anybody has about any of these issues or about Cambridge Analytica more generally. I'm coming out with a book in due course called Propaganda Machine: Inside Cambridge Analytica and the Digital Influence Industry. And that's going to be looking at these issues of how governments were involved, a little bit about how academics were involved, but also, of course, the companies themselves and the wider industry and all of the clients that Cambridge Analytica was working with and SCL. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions and looking forward to it. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. That was absolutely great. As she says, we're going to have a Q&A. We're going to have a short break now, and we'll come back at 9 p.m. our time. And I think we've got you for half an hour of questions, and then you have to escape for a call. So we'll try and get as many in as we can, and we'll see you back then. If you want to donate to the Free Fringe, PBH Free Fringe, so you can come and see shows next year, hopefully, COVID permitting, then donate at paypal.me/free fringe, and the link will come up during the break. And we'll see you back in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Welcome back. We're here with Emma for some questions, so I'll get right to it because I know we don't have you for very long. So first question from Bryce. Do you think if Facebook became a paid-for service like a membership model where you could opt out of targeted advertising, could this situation have been avoided to begin with?
From the beginning, I think Facebook should be a non-profit. I think we should break the whole thing up and turn it into a not-for-profit. And I think that the future of the internet should be open source. And I don't think we should have subscription because I think it excludes people. And actually, these kinds of social networks are kind of important for us. But I believe that we need transferability. So, for instance, I believe that Facebook, you should be able to sort of take your data from Facebook and take it to another platform, because the problem of competition when it comes to Facebook is that they won't let you take your data and take it to somewhere else, and that interoperability, if you like, of the data is essential. But in order to be able to do that, what we need is privacy legislation in the United States, so that Facebook can let go of your data and you take it somewhere else, and we know it's safe in that other place, so that we're not like inviting in another Cambridge Analytica scandal. In terms of paid for services like this, I think that this could be problematic because actually, it results in something of an inequality, a digital inequality. And different parts of the world obviously would experience this more heavily than others. And what we don't want is more digital inequality around the world. We need to create international agreements and international law, for instance, that are providing a protection for people internationally, so who might be using these kinds of tools.
Our next question from Ewan Duffrey. Given the impact of tracking and advertising technologies and their use in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, would you say that ad blocking and privacy tools are a form of online self-defense that the public can and should use?
Definitely. Get a VPN, and oh God, like so much. Don't use Facebook at all. I just at the moment, don't use Facebook. Like, let's campaign for non-profit, open source. Like, we need to reform all of this, but honestly, get out of Facebook now.
They held my account hostage. They held my account hostage last week because I wouldn't hand over my mobile number. And honestly, if I didn't need it for Skeptics, I would have just given up at that point.
It's depressing.
Yeah.
The problem is, even if you delete all of your data, it's very difficult to know that your data isn't out there somewhere. The problem is we need this privacy legislation. We need all of these protections, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do something now. You absolutely should. And that if you go to a page called Fluff Busting, what's it called? It's a weird name. Facebook. Hang on. I'm sure it's Fluff Busting. Is it? Oh, damn it. I can't remember the name of it. I'm sorry.
If you want to send us to an email, we can put a post up about it later.
Yeah.
On Facebook, ironically.
There's a privacy, I'm sure it's called Fluff Busting or something like this, that you can install the app onto your Facebook and it will go through and help you to make your Facebook profile properly private. But that still isn't really good enough. That's just if you are gonna use it anyway. I would just not use it at all. And you need to be really, really careful about what you put out into the public domain in terms of photographs, in terms of like declaring information about yourself on Twitter. Just be aware that literally anything can be used to to profile you and target advertising. Also, go through all of your cookies. Spend all of this time like turning these tracking cookies off. Worry about the dating apps, for instance, that are like asking you all those really personal questions and then sharing it with third parties. Be aware of literally everything you're using as being part of this surveillance capitalism nightmare, because it all is being utilized to harvest data. And the ICO and the GDPR are obviously really much better in the UK than in the United States legislative environment. However, the ICO is only going to act on things once they know about them. Once they know a data breach has occurred, then they will do something. And the problem is about identifying things and enforcing. And we also, of course, are leaving the EU. And so there are questions over whether or not we're going to be able to be in alignment with and in compliance with the EU in order to enable this kind of data sharing across borders, if you like. And the fact that the ICO has not acted upon issues with relation to the British government during COVID has been a subject of a complaint by many British politicians in the last few days, which raises the concern about whether or not we're going to be compliant with GDPR. So looking after yourself is extremely important, but there is a limit to that. So we need to campaign for more privacy and better technological responses, as well as for a proper response to oversight of the influence industry and regulation.
I always find it funny when you get the crazy COVID conspiracies about Bill Gates going to put a tracking chip into you through a vaccine, which they complain about on Facebook, on their iPhone, that's tracking everything that they do, and they don't realise that that's the more worrisome danger. They don't realise the irony of it. I think that covered one of Bryce's other questions, basically asking about VPN and Tor and everything else as well.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Bryce basically asked the same question, but you just covered then about using VPNs and Tor and things to protect yourself. I know there's also a special add-on you can get for the Google page, which turns the Daily Mail into kittens in case you actually accidentally end up on the Daily Mail. So that's an important one to add on.
That's rather good. So I use ad blockers and things like this. I also use what's it called? Here we are. Facebook. Actually, it's FB Purity, Facebook Purity. So that's the one for making sure that your Facebook is private. And there's things like Privacy Badger. You also probably need to be thinking about password managers. VPNs are a standard. I mean, everybody needs to be thinking about encrypted emails, encrypted messaging systems, like, for instance, using Signal. And also, we're on Zoom. Zoom is not very good when it comes to privacy and security. And Jitsi is generally the sort of more secure standard now. And it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to know what kind of technologies to use when it comes to protecting themselves online.
And it becomes like a utility. Like Facebook to me is like email. It's something that you can't do without to communicate with some people in your circles, like a grandma or whatever who you only have on Facebook, and that's the best way to communicate. And they lock you in with that way. So
I mean, during the period where the Cambridge Analytica revelations were happening, I was so worried with the things that were going on, with being targeted and so on, that it was very difficult for me to actually communicate with my family and friends and mentors and things like this, because these people didn't use encrypted apps. And I was worried about, making myself and them vulnerable. So I was in this little bubble where I couldn't talk to anyone. Very, very difficult time to go through. And, really my life hasn't changed terribly much, although thankfully more people are using the encrypted apps and are a little bit more aware of their privacy.
So another question from where's it gone? Oh, another question from Bryce. Do you think the UK government needs more regulations targeting social media?
Yes, social media. Yes. I mean, honestly, though, I mean, we do. Like I said, I mean, I think it's not just about the UK as well. The UK is limited on what it can do. It needs to be coming from the United States, really, for the really big changes, and that would affect the companies enough to, help the world. I honestly think that we need to do more in terms of the influence industry and our own government and how it is using data, and how you know how the how influence campaigns are being fought in relation to external actors, because I think we're a lot of the time we're creating these technologies which then are making us vulnerable. And the ways in which we're fighting information wars are really problematic. We are making huge errors that are causing us issues in relation to our future and conflicts that are ongoing. I can't say too much about, but I honestly think that we need to look at the way that our government is basically opening up spending in the influence industry to try to put more money in the hands of these companies that essentially were responsible for these crises. So, these private contractors that the government hires to counter disinformation are the same ones who are going off around the world doing it, and this is the core problem that we're not even talking about. And yes, we need to think about social media companies, but it's if we keep going to Facebook and telling them to take down posts, this is like whack-a-mole. This is not going to sort the problem out. What we really need to be doing is thinking about like the whole industry that's putting them there in the first place, the governments that are putting them there in the first place, how it's getting funded through dark money, these kinds of bad actors that we can't even see because we don't have the transparency data that would illuminate that industry. So that is kind of more my priority with my kind of research.
Yeah, I think I'm right in that Palantir is involved with COVID stuff over here and might have access to NHS data, so that's reassuring.
So yeah, the Palantir obviously were the ones who Chris Wiley has said suggested that Cambridge Analytica go to Cambridge University to do the kind of data harvesting that way in his book. So this is a company that's working for ICE in America, the immigration police, as well as cross-governmentally. Actually, now they're even responsible for the U.S. Census, and these companies are huge. But we also are forgetting that actually also Amazon and Google are also huge and working for our governments. And basically, these companies are surveillance infrastructure. So the whole industry is interconnected, and we need to be recognizing that actually this, Amazon isn't just a website where you buy stuff. It's, way bigger than this. And thinking about, well, do we want these giant monopolies to have this much power online? I want to start us thinking about civic technology. How do we build a world where this public infrastructure that all these companies are is in our hands and not in being made vulnerable essentially to market forces or potentially to the abuses of people who are, not acting in our interests.
Well, I guess this brings us on to Kitty's question. Could we trust the government to comply with any legislation that they brought in?
That's kind of sweeping, and yeah, but I get your point. The issue is that I think a lot of this stuff we need independent regulators for. I think when it comes to some of my suggestions, like freedom of information. Hello, did you get that?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So some of my suggestions about freedom of information and things like this, this would operate in a similar way to the GDPR does now, with requiring companies, submit information. And yeah, I think that works quite well. We have quite a good history of regulating independently in the UK. That doesn't mean it's flawless, and it doesn't mean that our governments always do the right thing. And I am very concerned about efforts to, establish new technologies, for instance, by MI6, who are investing in private companies that will, be acting in the security space, which generally is just creating more disturbing infrastructure. And we have very little ability to interrogate what our governments are doing in relation to security. They do not like giving out information through information requests about, what we do in warfare. And we need to know more about that. So yes, of course, there are limits to what we're going to be able to find out. And, we need to obviously be looking more at how we can reveal this through journalism and through, investing in research that opens up and makes more transparent our political system. So I think we should be using data that is available all across the internet to illuminate these people and the responsible parties more. And I don't, there's loads of data that's out there that's public that is not being used in a way that would really illuminate the industries and the powerful actors that are shaping our world. And we can also be pushing for more transparency information, like Companies House, why not the beneficial owners of companies and so on, making all this data available would be really, really helpful if we expanded these kinds of initiatives. And that would be, quite helpful to journalists in holding people to account. We also need to resist measures to weaken journalism through, the extension of the sorry, I'm just getting tired. Official Secrets Act. There are attempts. I absolutely believe that we should be, introducing something similar to the American Foreign Agents Act to stop, foreign money, for instance, coming into our politics. But making it harder for whistleblowing to happen is a side effect of this that is really problematic. And they're trying to sneak in clauses that will be very anti-journalism. So we need to be really careful how we do these things. And governments are going to resist it, but that's why we have researchers and journalists and try to write letters to our MPs and demand things to be done better.
Yeah, it's hard to have any faith in the current Westminster government, though, especially as they've used these tactics to get where they are. They're not going to do anything to oppose these tactics in any way because they need them to be in power.
Yeah, but we just have to keep fighting. Ultimately, it's not worth giving up. I mean, look how much we've achieved in the last couple of years. I mean, it might not feel like a lot, but actually it is. So I mean, I reeled off all of those fines that Facebook got. I mean, okay, that's not enough. And that's other things we can do is to be demanding stronger penalties for things. The electoral laws that were bent and broken in 2016 need strengthening. And we can demand really punitive penalties for things that people are getting away with and seeing as a cost of doing business. There are lots of ways we can fix things that wouldn't take a lot, and we just have to keep fighting on each of these single issues.
Yeah, the Electoral Commission needs updating for the 21st century, because it feels ridiculous when you've got Purdo on broadcast media, but your Facebook feed can tell you very personal things the minute you're going to vote. Yes,
I know, that's really worrying. Yeah. Yes, and the people who are involved in these companies are really, really disturbing. Peter Thiel, and the relationships that we've seen between Zuckerberg and these leaders around the world, and the different policy differentials between the way that Facebook does business here and, for instance, in India. It almost seems like special favors. So we need to be really fighting on these kinds of issues.
I guess one hope would be if we get a Biden presidency, and then maybe Elizabeth Warren can do something about monopolies or something.
That would be amazing.
There's still that hope till November, at least.
Yes. I mean, I hope that happens. I don't have huge faith in Biden, I'll be honest, but he's definitely better than the other one.
Yes.
Statement of the year.
Yes, he was the worst of the candidates in my opinion, but he's better than Trump. But that's not saying
definitely,
much.
And I hope everyone votes for him.
One last question from our audience before we let you get off before your call. I doubt you'll agree with this, but John Minton asks, do you think Tony Blair was right to describe the Freedom of Information Act as his greatest regret?
No. I don't agree with that. I understand it because, obviously there are, it's a hell of a lot to process. And this is one of the issues, is the amount of processing that is required for these kinds of things costs a lot of money. It winds government up in a lot of bureaucracy. It also means that people don't write things down. People don't put things in emails. So, they're self-censoring in government. You end up with sort of secrecy practices, and things don't necessarily go into the record. So there are all sorts of positives and negatives with freedom of information. There's also all of this data out there that most people don't ever look at, sadly. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be there. No. And I absolutely believe that this transparency is important, but that we should be using this information more effectively. And actually, I think building ways to map all of this information and pull it together for the public interest in terms of helping journalists be able to just come to the information really quickly and visualizing it in ways that the public can understand should be part of the research that we're doing and the development of future journalistic projects.
Yeah. I also keep thinking that maybe, an independent Scotland might have a chance to do these things a bit better as well. But that's my only other ray of hope.
That would be great.
Well, we'll let you get off, so you've got a few minutes before your call. But thank you so much for your contribution this evening. It's been fantastic to talk to you. And depressing, but you gave me some hope. You're still cheerful. And you know more
Yeah,
about
very
this
much.
than me.
You got to stay optimistic. Thank you very much, and I enjoyed doing the talk and joining you all. And thanks very much for the questions from the audience. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye. And everyone on the video, we are going to give you a link now to the Zoom chat that we are in. If you want to join us for a little bit of a social gathering, we'll be in here having a chat for the next hour or so, and that link should be in the chat on YouTube now. If Mark's done his job. And I'll remind you again, if you want to donate, please do so at paypal.me/freefringe, and that will go towards PBH Free Fringe to keep them going for next year so that we can have the fringe next year and we won't, go bankrupt. We'll see you in the chat, and I'll hope to see you on the 15th September for my dad talking to us about chemical regulation and hopefully making it entertaining and fun and letting you know why being in the EU is the best. And we'll see you then. Bye bye.